Hello, I'm Rachel, and welcome to Launching Your e-course to the Next Level. I'm excited for us to learn together today. While it might seem like the same practices and strategies for teaching in-seat classes transition to e-learning courses, it is important to make sure the e-courses we design are structurally sound and infused with best practices. The purpose of today's module is to learn the cognitive theory of multimedia learning and apply 3 key e-learning principles to help reduce cognitive overload of our learners into an existing e-learning course. Before we dive into the key principles, we need to make sure we have a good understanding on how learners learn. Click on the brain to investigate. The Cognitive Theory of Multimedia Learning by Dr. Richard Mayer teaches us 3 important things about how we learn. Number 1, people have 2 separate channels for processing information. One to process visual material and another to process auditorial material, also known as dual channels. Number 2, these dual channels are recognized to have limited capacity, meaning people can only process a few pieces of information in each channel at one time. Continuing to present information to a person with an already filled capacity will hinder the learning process. Number 3, learning is an active process that occurs when people pay attention to relevant information, organize it into a coherent structure, and integrate it with what they already know. So what does this all mean? People use auditory and visual channels to take in information. The capacity to take in the information is limited, and people will select relevant information and integrate it with prior knowledge. This is the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. Let's examine the cognitive theory of multimedia learning in terms of memory. In a multimedia presentation, information is presented in either words or pictures. The sensory memory then filters the information through the auditorial channel or the visual channel. Notice that on-screen words can be sensed with the ears if it is audio and the eyes if it is on screen. Then the working memory selects and organizes information, and finally, the long-term memory will integrate the new information with prior knowledge. Because of our learners' limited cognitive capacity, it is important to know the 3 kinds of processing demands so that we can create courses that maximize student learning. The first one is extraneous processing. This cognitive process does not support the instructional objectives and is created by poor layout of instruction, such as too much text or meaningless graphics. The second is essential processing. This cognitive process consists mainly of selecting the relevant material. It is created by the complexity of material presented. The third is generative processing. This process deepens understanding of core material, where information is organized and integrated with prior knowledge. This process is dependent on learners' motivation. Let's take a deeper look at one of these processes. Extraneous processing is the one process instructional designers have complete control over. Poor instructional design can lead to extraneous overload. This occurs when there is too much information presented. Since you have control of this form of processing, there are techniques you can apply to reduce the overload. Here is Jenna Lee. She's a 7th grader in Mr. Plath's science class. Click on Jenna's computer to explore her e-course module. Even without hearing the audio, we can see there is a lot going on here for Jenna to comprehend. Because there are so many graphics, it is hard to determine which ones are most important. In addition to the graphics, her visual channel is also processing the text on the screen. This same text is simultaneously being processed in the auditory channel. Since there is so much information here for Jenna to process, she does not have enough capacity remaining to comprehend the essential material being presented in order to organize and integrate it into her long-term memory. There are 3 principles Mr. Plath can use to remove the extraneous material and help reduce the cognitive load on his students. Click on the first principle to learn how Mr. Plath can minimize extraneous processing. The coherency principle teaches us to keep our lesson uncluttered by avoiding material that does not support instructional goals. There are 3 ways we can declutter e-courses. First, avoid e-lessons with extraneous words. Ask yourself, are these words essential to the instructional goal? If the answer is no, then remove them. Second, avoid lessons with extraneous graphics. Interesting or decorative graphics that are not essential to the knowledge and skills being learned will do more harm than good. They can distract learners and confuse learners of what is essential to the lesson. When the goal is to help learners build understanding, it is beneficial to use a simpler visual such as a line drawing. Third, avoid lessons with extraneous audio. Think back to our learners' dual channels. Extra background music or sound effects will overload the already limited capacity of the auditory channel. Here we see a non-example. This lesson slide violates the coherency principle on multiple levels. First, the extra fire, fire, fire words are not essential to the instructional goal and should be removed. Second, while this lesson is about how to use a fire extinguisher, the decorative graphic of the firefighter, the fire extinguisher, and the fireballs do not serve an educational purpose. They only confuse our learners and distract from the important step-by-step graphic. Now we have a good example of how following the coherency principle can maximize the learning opportunity. Only the essential information is presented to the learner, so there is nothing to overload the already limited cognitive capacity. When designing e-lessons, always make sure the instructional goals are driving the decisions you make in regards to words, graphics, and audio. Click on the second principle to continue. The Contiguity principle teaches us to align words with corresponding graphics. Evidence shows that learning is enhanced when written words are integrated with graphics. For example, when a graphic is a diagram showing the parts of an object, such as the fire extinguisher, pictured here, the word should be integrated with the parts of a diagram by using a line to connect the name to the part. The printed names should not be off to the side or on the bottom. This would split the learner's attention, having to go back and forth to locate the name or description. You should avoid lessons that cause learners to split attention because they force the learner to waste precious cognitive processing on trying to coordinate the 2 sources of information. In addition, spoken words should be presented simultaneously with graphics instead of presented separately. This video is a non-example. Words are presented first, then comes the graphical information. When the learner has to do the added work of connecting the spoken words to the corresponding parts in the diagram, the limited capacity of working memory is taxed, leading to cognitive overload. Some essential text or graphical information may be lost as the learner tries to piece the information together. Press the play button to view the video non-example.
Determine that the extinguisher is the correct type for the hazard. Proceed to operate the extinguisher using the pass technique to control and extinguish the fire. First, hold the extinguisher upright and pull the pin. Next, stand 8 to 10 feet from the fire and aim the nozzle at the base of the fire. Do not get too close or aim the nozzle too high. Once the nozzle is aimed at the base of the fire, squeeze the levers together to begin discharge of the fire extinguishing agent. Maintain your distance from the fire and sweep the nozzle from side to side, sweeping 3 to 6 inches beyond the right and left edges.
This second video is a good example of spoken words and text occurring simultaneously. The learner's working memory is better able to retain and process the essential information. Click the play button to view the video.
Determine that the extinguisher is the correct type for the hazard. Proceed to operate the extinguisher using the pass technique to control and extinguish the fire. First, hold the extinguisher upright and pull the pin. Next, stand 8 to 10 feet from the fire and aim the nozzle at the base of the fire. Do not get too close or aim the nozzle too high. Once the nozzle is aimed at
Click on the third principle to learn about the final principle. The redundancy principle teaches to use graphics and audio rather than graphics, audio, and on-screen text. In general, this means do not add printed text to a narrated graphic. By presenting redundant on-screen text can cause a learner to pay less attention to important graphics or diagrams as they try to match the on-screen text with the identical audio, as represented in this fire extinguisher class example. Too much information is being presented here for a learner to process. However, when the redundancy is removed, learners can now select the essential information to process. It is important to note, if on-screen text is needed, make sure it is only a few selected words presented next to the graphic that they describe. Now that we have a firm understanding of the three important principles, let's apply them to Mr. Plath's lesson. By applying the coherency principle, we can remove unnecessary words and graphics. We want to make sure the information presented is need to know, not just nice to know, which is why we want to remove the sentence, carbon gets its name from the Latin word carbo. This fact is not essential to the instructional goal. Next, we can apply the contiguity principle and integrate words with a corresponding carbon graphic. By doing this, Jenna will no longer have to split her attention to select which words go with which part of the graphic. And finally, by applying the redundancy principle, we can remove the identical written words and present the information in audio and graphic. Now we are left with a lesson that provides the essential information for Jenna to process with no cognitive overload. To recap, today we learned about the cognitive theory of multimedia learning and applied 3 key principles of e-learning to minimize extraneous processing in a course. Now I want to challenge you to review the e-courses you've designed and remove any extraneous material that inhibits your students from successfully processing the essential material.